Hello, I'm Jennifer Leonard, President and CEO of Rochester Area Community Foundation. We are delighted to welcome you to another in our Intersection webinar series about topics that connect the Foundation's focus areas of equity and vitality. Today's virtual fireside chat features two experienced Foundation executives who will address how to galvanize local leadership around rethinking community justice policies, the importance of centering racial equity in that work, and the respective roles of community and philanthropy. We will post our speakers' full bios in chat, but let me share some exciting highlights. Candice C. Jones is President and CEO of the National Public Welfare Foundation in Washington, D.C. She previously worked for Chicago CRED to expand investments in violence intervention as an alternative to the criminal justice system. As director of the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, Candice pushed significant reforms that reduced the number of youth in state custody. As a White House fellow, she worked to open up educational opportunities for youth and adults behind bars. She also addressed racial inequities in criminal justice as a program officer at the MacArthur Foundation. Melancha Clark is President and CEO of the Hudson Weber Foundation in Detroit. She previously held senior positions in the Obama administration, including Chief of Staff in the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services at the Department of Justice, Senior Policy Advisor with the White House Domestic Policy Council, and Senior Counsel with the DOJ's Access to Justice Initiative. Earlier in her legal career, Melanca was counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, addressed economic justice with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and was a fellow in public interest and constitutional law with the Gibbons Law Firm. Welcome and thank you for joining us today, Candice and Melanca.
Thank you so much. I am Candice, and I'm thrilled to actually introduce Melanca, my colleague and long-term respected colleague of mine. I'm just going to run your bio down again, Melanca, and I know that you're going to cringe, but bear with me because I think it's very important, and I think it will undergird some of the work we're going to talk about. Got a bachelor's degree from Brown, a JD from Harvard. You are a Skadden Fellow, and for those of you watching who are not sort of drowning in legal jargon, it is a very prestigious law fellowship that landed you at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund early in your career. You were a federal clerk for the Honorable Joseph Greenway in the District Court of New Jersey, also a very prestigious legal step to take out of law school. You were one of the founding staff members in the Obama administration Office of Access to Justice, which was an office created to really look at these issues. And after serving at the Domestic Policy Council and Access to Justice, you became Chief of Staff in the Office of Community-Oriented Policing at the Department of Justice, which also allowed you to hold the role of Chief of Staff to the Task Force on 21st Century Policing.
Yes,
you were a little busy before you arrived at Hudson Weber, ma'am.
Busy like you, Candice. Yes, indeed.
And now President and CEO of Hudson Weber. Talk about what Hudson Weber's role and goal is as a philanthropic institution.
Sure. And thank you, Candice. So just to provide a little context, of course, around the Hudson Weber Foundation, we've got a nearly 40-year history in our city. So long history with an enduring mission of improving the quality of life in the city. We're an independent foundation. We're lucky enough to have several family members, Hudson family members, which are, of course, related to the Hudson and Webers, who started a much beloved department store at the turn of the 20th century that eventually became the Dayton Hudson Corporation, which became the Target Corporation, and that the shares from that company are what fund our corpus. So I joined the foundation in 2016. I mentioned the enduring mission. We have a broad portfolio, so community and economic development, arts and culture, built environment, and what we call our safe and just communities portfolio, which I know we'll be talking about today. When I came in, we did a deep dive around a new strategy for the foundation that was really about intentionally connecting people and communities to opportunity. And the flip side of that, of course, was addressing structural barriers to opportunity, of which we will be speaking.
I love the reason I asked you to talk about Hudson Weber, and I love it, is because as a national foundation, you know this, one of the things that we do is that we partner with jurisdictions that are working on justice reform. And sometimes I think what happens, particularly in our work, is there's an outside focus on the role that national philanthropic organizations are playing, when the truth is that my belief, and I hope that your belief, is that really the ability to sort of grow and sustain strong work breaks on what's happening with philanthropic partners on the ground there. And it's been so important because of the long-standing work of Hudson Weber, because of the reputation, both at institutions and yours. I think what's happening in Michigan has been possible. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to start there. When you came in, you were doing that strategic work. What had the legacy on criminal and youth justice work been for the foundation up until that point?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, 40-year history in our city. So certainly the work had evolved and changed over those many years, and lots of different types of partners. But I'd say as I was coming in, our foundation was just coming off a really focused, intensive work around revitalizing the downtown and the midtown. And so all of the mission areas were sort of in service of that goal and bringing people into the downtown and a lot of placemaking. And so in fact, I'd say much of the work in what was then called our Safe Community portfolio was around, expanding capacity of some of the partners that were literally keeping communities safe. For example, there's a university law enforcement agency that was in Midtown, which is where we had major investments. And so there was a pretty significant investment with that partner.
And so to me, it feels like you spun this work, out of like silk almost. You came in with your background. You guys have really started to focus on justice. And by you, I mean the collective you of partners in Michigan on the ground. What was the impetus for that? What about your background made you look at what the Hudson Weber Foundation was trying to do around safety and say, this is really we have to grow and think about this work and start to bring partners in?
Yeah, so I certainly was coming in, so lawyer, as you mentioned, by training, that had been litigating and then moved pretty swiftly into policy work. Systems change, and it felt like if we were going to be serious about this sort of opportunity imperative, the shared prosperity imperative, that we would have to be doing systems work. When you look at the scope and scale of our communities here in Detroit, the involvement with the criminal justice system, I certainly had been, and I have to say, this is what is so, although with the national conversation, thank goodness, these issues have been elevated even further. But, I went through law school, a year of criminal law and criminal procedure without any mention of how racialized our criminal enforcement system is, and also how out of whack in terms of our responses to, social problems, how out of whack it is with the rest of the world, literally. So, I know you know these statistics, but 4% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population, all of those things, it's sort of, I instill, and I'm hope that it has changed by now. You went back to Harvard, but the idea that you could sort of run through the course and not understand that was remarkable to me. And I went through it, actually. I mean, I sort of, came to this work and this learning. I had this goal of going to the NAACP and working on education. And sort of as the information was sort of revealed around what an obstacle and impediment and how many African Americans were caught up, and how it had implications well beyond just that folks were in prison, but implications for families, all of sort of the discrimination and bias that, for example, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund works on is magnified by the intersection of the criminal justice system and those things, housing, voting, education, all the things. So I came into it very certain that to move the needle on the portfolio that I wanted to create for us at the foundation was going to take system-wide, statewide policy work. But we were a Detroit funder.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I had to navigate how, not only are we a Detroit funder, we also, just in terms of our staff capacity, and that's important to note, we've got 7 staff, you know, in addition to myself, 2 other program folks.
I love this.
So,
the reason I love this, I just want to draw, just double down on some things that I hear you saying. One thing that I want to talk about is I love this idea that you were trying to look at sort of how you build community vitality, how you think about safety sort of in an expanse way, and how do you do that without systems change. And I think that's so important. Pew in 2010, coming out of the 2008 crisis, was doing these series of studies on economic mobility. They did ones around race. They did one on folks who were white, folks who were Latino, folks who were Black. And interestingly enough, though, this was a team that was not a criminal justice policy team. It was an economic mobility team. When they were doing the economic mobility study on the African American community, the data that they found that the trajectory of that community was indivisible from these outcomes in CJ. And so they spent time talking about that issue in the report in the way they had to cover in any of those other studies. And it was as surprising to that team. And so I love what you're saying, because as we talk to the community in Rochester, part of what I'm always trying to communicate is that people are sort of looking at how they want health and vitality in their community from a lot of lenses. But the truth is that it's a mistake to neglect this issue, because in many respects, it's indivisible if you are indeed trying to lift the entire tide of your community. So I love that you arrived there when you were in Michigan. I know one of the things that you did really early on, to your point, you're like, we're doing systems change, and systems change takes a lot. You sort of decided to bring together a group to start to have a conversation. Talk about how you arrived at that decision and how you were thinking intentionally about who needed to be at that table.
Sure. So 2018, I decided that a good use of our resource and capacity was to pull together a statewide convening, and went through sort of, you know, just building on background of being in the federal government, and obviously the policy work beforehand, but understood the significance of setting a table and laying out, you know, together collaboratively, getting on the same page around what the issues are and what the potential action steps for a path forward. That seemed to make sense to me. And I felt like coming in to Hudson Weber, you know, there were different ways that we could do this. And often, and this is a wonderful thing to do too, foundations will support an organization or an entity that is trying to pull together convenings and support it. It felt to me that it would be powerful for Hudson Weber, with the reputation and the trust and, you know, our longstanding role in the community, to actually be a convener. We didn't do it by ourselves. We, so Hudson Weber, we kept our, you know, kept our convening role, but partnered, decided to do 2 things. One day focused on the adult system, and a day focused on the youth system. For the adult system, we partnered with 2 policy organizations, both nonpartisan, but one known to be, or perceived to be, right of center, and one perceived to be left of center. And then for the Youth Day, we partnered with the Governor's Committee on Juvenile Justice, which is their the administrating agency that distributes Title II funds. And I just say, it's worth noting, it was September of 2018. November of that year was statewide elections in our state for governor, all the statewide offices, AG, Secretary of State, and the like. We invited those running for those offices into our convening. And we, you know, the pull-up point felt like to reinforce for our electeds and our communities, not that this is a bipartisan issue as much as this is a nonpartisan issue. And so that was sort of a powerful thing. And we did get electeds to speak to us, who then, you know, in having to do that, had to lay out what their objectives or priorities were. And then significantly, we had a very curated group of folk coming into these convenings that were diverse in terms of state administrators, the judiciary, law enforcement, impacted people, advocates, the full gamut. And really, when you think about it, certainly there had been no documented history of a statewide convening on CJ and JJ issues in the state, at least in recent history. But also, really, the holistic approach to these issues felt, it felt like, certainly did need to have all these multiple different stakeholders to come together around it.
Can I ask you about that? Because I love that. I hear you saying a lot of things, which is that, I mean, one, you had both adult criminal justice stakeholders and youth justice stakeholders, right? Intentionality. Yeah. You had, policy making officials, but also impacted people and families and all the folks in between. Intentionality. But it's difficult, right, to be so intentional about those groups. What made you believe that all of those groups had to be represented? And then how do you navigate that, sort of holding a table where you equalize those voices?
So we put a lot of time into the pre-work.
Always, right?
Yes. And, in terms of figuring out the right folks, and that's, so many ways in which our partners at this convening were so important, but certainly they helped us build out the list. But also we didn't go into that convening empty-handed. We did a draft canvas of pre-work with the tables that we were setting to identify what was the state of play around these issues. So remember, for both the youth and the adult system, we set, I think, 6 tables, and each table it was like, from prevention all the way to reentry on the back end. And then also for both sessions, we had a data and transparency table, and I just note that because so much exciting work happening in that space. But so we did the legwork beforehand to curate this thing, and also to have people ready to do the work, that they would come into these learning sessions. It wasn't a talk at you type of conference. It was a literal roundtable, and it was called the Michigan Safety and Justice Roundtable. Literally had roundtables where we had discussant leads, but literally everybody there was on equal footing. There was no particular expert that was being featured, and folks were reacting to some preliminary work, but then providing input. So it wasn't sort of, incoherent in terms of like where the activity could be directed. But out of that, the space, where it was most exciting was the consensus work around the action steps out of each of those areas.
Can I ask you, as we get to those action steps, tell me what were your goals walking into that meeting? Because I love to hear you talk about this, because you were really clear about that. And then what the goals were coming out of that meeting from the collective that you had pulled together.
So multiple goals, I'd say, with my funder hat on. So we didn't want to be the tail wagging the dog, but certainly for me, as we were building out our strategy, I had a couple of different options, or the foundation did, in terms of how to approach that. And we could have hired a consultant to do a scan. And that is important work to do. And we did actually, Michigan Justice Fund did invest in such a scan. But that scan was informed by the work that was done in this initial convening. And so I felt like there were funders at this table for sure. And what came out of that convening with the funders is then a group of us came together, and I want to come back to a really important point that you made about sort of the intersection of these issues. But it wasn't for funders. It was for the state. Yeah. It was to elevate this conversation as we headed into a new leadership in the state, and it was to plant seeds. And I wasn't, certainly, pulling strings behind the scenes, knowing exactly what was going to spark. But I knew enough about the work that I'd done previously that these type of things do spark seeds, and you see where it leads. And philanthropy and others, it wasn't just about philanthropy, but that we would be able to come from there and have a sense of where it might make sense to lean in.
I love that. You, I'm saying this now, this isn't even a question. Coming out of those convenings, you were able to galvanize a tremendous amount, both of local philanthropic support and national philanthropic support. this was, as you know, 2018, 2019. This is well before the racial justice uprisings last summer, the unjust killings of, I don't even want to start naming all the people that we've lost in the last couple of years and all the people that have preceded them. But it was before the moment when we were having sort of this most current national reckoning, and you still were able to really get this issue in Michigan specifically on the agenda. Why do you believe that happened? I can tell you, once you respond, I will tell you why we were so excited to bet on Michigan.
Yes, would love to hear that, because public welfare, of course, has been such an important part of this collaborative. But yeah, no, we came out of that roundtable, and just to, focus on the funder piece and to connect to a point that you made. So we just in terms of the landscape in Michigan, there are obvious, as I mentioned, we're a local funder. We are one of the few local funders that have a dedicated mission area, what we call it, around this work. There were certainly funders across the state that fund in this space, but no one that was sort of holding the work together. And then we had national funders that were coming in and thinking about the state, but weren't here in place. And what I thought was really fascinating about the table that we set and the way we oriented is really, I think the reason why we were so successful is that, to your point, folks that were funding in other priority areas, housing, all the things that I mentioned, education, and broadly, many of our funders, as in many places, are around opportunity, are funding around opportunity in one way or the other. And what they were finding is that they could not do that work and not hit up against the implications of the over-involvement of our populations in the CJ system. And so that was the thread that connected folks. And I think, when we started, where we've landed, and we'll get to talk about the Michigan Justice Fund, but where we started, all I was sort of asking and inviting people to consider, and, is there a place of shared learning for us to have a better picture of the organizational ecosystem in which our grantees or potential grantees are operating? And can we together learn more around the state legislative landscape that none of us were necessarily individually tracking? And that's where the confluence of having our local partners and our national partners were just really powerful.
I love that. I just want to thank everyone in the Rochester community again for being a part of this conversation. As I said at the outset, if you've joined us today, you've already started on this road with us, and we appreciate you. I know there are questions popping up in the chat. Know that the team at the Rochester Community Foundation, Maya Crane and her colleagues, are pulling those questions together. And after talking for a little bit, we're going to turn to your questions and respond. I just wanted to let you know that we see you and we're listening. I want to talk to you about what I saw as the reasons that we were so excited about Michigan. And a big part of that was what you had done, the work to sort of galvanize this table. When I hear you talking, you're saying all these things, right? You're just dropping these massive nuggets, which is that how are you as a philanthropic leader acting as a convener? We take for granted that some of the times the only thing that you have to give is not the resources. That leadership was huge, because as a national funder, when you're looking across the country and sort of saying, you were already saying, actually, let's pull these threads together, not with a perfect, strategy in place, but let's actually be really intentional about starting to pull people together, because in that, what you can do is leverage this opportunity to have the full force of all these institutions, advocates, policymakers, not be always in perfect alignment, but pushing in the same direction. And that gave us something really special, it felt like, to bet on. And so that's why I continue to be in awe of what you're doing there.
Yeah.
So talk to me. Okay, I'm going to shift us a little bit because I want to get to where that table is a couple years later. You guys have done a ton. You're drawing down resources. Talk about what you see as some of the near-term opportunities and also challenges of what has now become a more formal table.
Yeah. So just to follow the journey around that formal table, we had these informal conversations, not just funders, advocates and practitioners too. But we were asking our fellow funders if there would be, the appetite about shared learning, and then beyond that, could there be a coordinated funding strategy? And so the answer for a number of organizations, including public welfare, so a nice mix of local and national, was like, yes, let's lean into this. And initially we leaned into capacity to do more engagement in the ecosystem scan that I mentioned. But then we really, you know, when we had the commitments that we needed to know this would be a thing, that we could move, we undertook a really intentional and deliberative process around building out a grant making strategy. And so we didn't go, and I, you know, coming into philanthropy, and it's funny being on the other side, you know, wonderful partnerships with funders of the work that I was doing, but really, you know, had the experience and knowledge that, you know, it's our practitioners on the ground, like those that are most proximate to the problems are the ones that are best situated to devise the solutions. And so, you know, what we learned from the ecosystem scan and sort of a theory of the case that we had around, like, what does a thriving and enabling environment look like? We need strong advocacy and law organizations. We need credible messengers that reach broad audiences. We need good data and transparency for accountability with our systems, but also to drive good decision making, all the things. Anyway, we took this year, we invited a cohort of advocates and practitioners, 26, to do a learning process with us for a year to refine goals and objectives, which became what we now have, which is the Michigan Justice Fund, which launched in January. We're up to $17 million. We've got 14 funders at our table. We're just about to announce part of our governance structure, a set of partner advisors that will be doing this work. So it's been a year.
Can I say what I hear? One of the things I hear is that after you set the table, and this is true, having been one of the things that you guys did really early was like, we're not just going to start convening, drawing a lot of people's time. We're going to really be intentional at the outset of saying we have to fund and support their time to collaborate with us in this process. And I think that that's important. And it's also important, you know, as a stakeholder on the ground, you guys were very clear about communicating that. We weren't going to have all these people starting to parachute in, asking partners on the ground, pulling them off their work without giving adequate support. And so right at the fore, it was important for you guys to say, we're going to establish a fund to support people to walk this road, so that they're supported even in an intentional way.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely, that's right.
Okay, talk to me about, so now you have $17 million, local and national funders, 26 organizations?
Yes, that were part of our learning cohort, yep.
A leadership structure, issues, you know, adult and youth justice, ranging from, you know, pretrial jail work to re-entry. That's a lot of people in the room. How are you intentional about holding those stakeholders together and making sure that that coalition continues to push in the same direction?
Yeah, so we did do some refinement over the course of the year. And so it's worth saying that. So 3 clear goals. One is around economic mobility and overall success, so ensuring that the systems and structures in place are supporting that. One is around decarceration and the, you know, and elimination of the over-incarceration and detention of young folks, so that's youth and adult side too. And then importantly, the third piece and goal is around building a movement. And that is around changing narrative, but it's also around building political power of those that are most impacted by these issues. And that is the piece that is the most exciting to me. And I think, you know, just again, to draw out what's significant and important about the national and local partnerships, I think nationals that do policy work come with their expertise. They see what's been successful elsewhere, which is phenomenal. But they also, for better or worse, can kind of drop in without sort of being ensconced in the community dynamics. And that can be good and bad. And I feel like the yin and yang of it for us, for those that are local, when you think about, and this is sort of the more existential question about philanthropy and power structures and boards. I have a phenomenal board of trustees. They are very traditional composition of foundations in that they are absolute power players in our community. And because of that, when you get into some of the deep work around mobilization, that is certainly agitation and advocacy and,
Yep.
Advocating against our mayor and our governor and all of those relationships that foundations hold. It's hard to do alone. So I was very just, thinking with my Hudson Weber hat on, very aware that it would be a wonderful place for me to be able to hold hand with others as we move into a space that was a new funding space for our foundation.
I love that. It's like you keep setting up. I feel like it's, and I'm going to do this because you're from Michigan and I'm actually from Chicago, so I'm going to make a Bulls reference. Because I always loved what resonated the year that the Bulls finally beat the Pistons out of the Eastern Conference. But I feel like you keep giving me these like Scottie Pippen setups, and I'm just going to slam it in, because my next question is, you talk about community stakeholders, directly impacted people. And I feel like in our work, we're increasingly trying to have some consciousness about that, but it's still a place where we struggle, right? And for all the reasons you were just talking about these complex power dynamics, how do you guys make sure that that is not some afterthought, but really central to the work that you're trying to do there?
Yeah, it's, really in two ways. It's like what we do and what we fund and how we do it. So obviously the planning year where we pulled together this cohort to kind of guide us through is an important piece of it. But the other thing to think about, so we, last year, COVID happened, obviously, and that sort of was not what we were planning for. So we, and I only mention that because there were live conversations. We weren't planning to do any funding last year other than to fund our cohort. But we did end up doing COVID-related funding. But I think even more importantly, because of who we were at the table of the, our state, our governor put together a task force on racial disparities in COVID. Obviously, this was the conversation. And making room and space, as we continue to do now with the American Recovery Plan, right? It's not just, philanthropy is very good about playing the inside game. I think, and I'm a pragmatist. I have been, in the government.
The inside game.
Exactly. But the sort of needle to thread is like, so we have this seat at the table. Obviously, we need to be champions ourselves and put, sort of our voice there. But it's also to make the space for others to come in. And that is very much how we're thinking about it. The ARP, obviously, in every community now is the topic du jour. But we are, literally, we invited the state budget director in to meet with the justice advocates and practitioners around their ideas about how the money should be spent. We will continue to lift up and source and resource so that those, that we're all together influencing these important decisions.
Sometimes when you're looking across your stakeholder, you're trying to center, you're trying to bring a coalition together. Sometimes in a community, you go in and everybody who you need to be at the table doesn't exist. Like all the organizations that you would want to have there aren't there yet. How do you think about the work of creating organizations and leadership where there are gaps?
Yeah. That's such a good way to put it. And I know coming into this work and learning more about the organizations that are on the ground, just hearing what the annual budget is for one of our organizations that's led by impacted, formerly incarcerated.
You're running on air, right? You're like, what?
Volunteers, all of that. And so I think that the opportunity here obviously is to be an accelerant for folks that are moving, but to really be intentional around that capacity. We're to be highly responsive. So we do, we have our 3 goals, and we have like a tight set of objectives around those goals around a 3-year funding timeline. And we need that. We need to be deliberate and intentional to make progress. But we've made enough room in that space so that we can be responsive, and that as on-the-ground campaigns take off, that may not absolutely neatly fit into the 3 things that we said, although building a movement is certainly the catch-all on where it would fit. But that we're responsive to that, so that we're meeting the moment and building that capacity where it's needed most.
You are meeting the moment, and I want to shift to talk a little bit about, as we're in Rochester, in a moment in history where thinking about policing, community policing, obviously you have incredible expertise on this issue that precedes your time at Hudson Weber, but you guys have just launched a community policing innovation initiative. Talk to me about that.
That's it. Yep.
And I think that there's a lot that can be learned, frankly, from folks all over the country. So talk to me a little bit about that work.
Sure. And I just, to link it all together, and certainly just on the MJF side, as you mentioned, we've been working on it for years. The national conversation occasioned by George Floyd's murder and all of the conversation around that was hugely significant. And I think, and I just continue to want to say, that policing is the most visible manifestation of a system that is brutalizing Black people. And so, part of Chauvin, like what was so, I think, all of it was terrible, but sort of his look of defiance was about not expecting to be held accountable, which is not just about policing, it's about all the structures behind it, the courts and the prosecutors and all of these things are working together. And so, so whenever we're thinking about policing, and wherever you are in the discussion, it should not ever be divorced from sort of all the larger parts of the system that contribute. It's just the most visible manifestation of it. But anyway, in light of what happened, because of the work that I had done with President Obama's task force, we have the former U.S. Attorney for Eastern Michigan on my board and also on our Community Foundation board for Southeast Michigan, Barb McQuaid, love her. We really just had a conversation to the point of meeting the moment, like surely there is some place to dig in. And I have to say, because these issues are so overwhelming that you can be stymied by but it's not solving all the problems. And it's not, but you got to start somewhere. And so what we came up with was really wanting to provide resource, not to law enforcement departments, but around technical assistance providers and community members that were going to partner with law enforcement agencies around a menu of things. And so the menu that we came up with was revision of use of force policies, racially disparate law enforcement practices, officer accountability, and then two sort of broader ones. One was we call Reimagining public safety. So the partnership that would come in for that wouldn't necessarily be a law enforcement agency, but could be a municipality. And then Truth and Reconciliation was the fifth piece. So we, put this together. We put it out to the community to see who would come. And we just announced our first round of grants with 5 law enforcement agencies with community partners that are coming in around those different menu items. And we're learning. And to the question that I know will be asked, there are, the levers of reform for policing are many, but the practices, but there is work to be done at all levels. And this is, it's important to acknowledge that, right? So we're starting with this piece for meeting agencies in our community. And for us as a Detroit funder, I mentioned all the multiple law enforcement agencies, but an important piece for us was that our community members are going into the suburbs, traveling through the communities outside of Detroit and are experiencing harassment and profiling and the like. There's actually I hope I'm not speaking out of school, but an agency that actually has a unit called Border Patrol. And they're not talking about Canada. So there's work to be done, and we're really just embracing, it's a diverse group of agencies and partners that are coming together.
I love that. If you're joined us today, in about a couple of minutes, I'm going to turn it over to the Rochester team to start to take your questions. So if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A section. I have 2 more questions for you, Ms. Melanca, and I'm so thrilled to I'm just living my best life right now. Able to be in conversation with you if you can't tell. Talk to me about, with all the work that you have done over the last several years on this issue, this doesn't even represent the full breadth and depth of your portfolio. but what do you see as some near-term opportunities, and what are challenges that you guys are going to continue to struggle with? Because there'll always be some of both.
Yeah. Well, I'd say just on the policy side, in Michigan, we're coming off a pretty exciting year in terms of legislatively. There was a package of reforms passed related to pretrial reform, which is great. We had clean slate legislation around expungement of records, which obviously relates to economic mobility. And also on the youth side, we had the passage of Raise the Age. Michigan was one of 4 states that were still automatically trying 17-year-olds as adults.
Never want to be on that kind of short list.
Exactly. So there's momentum that we want to take advantage of. And, we feel, our advocates, our practitioners are fired up. I think the linkages, sort of linking grassroots organizations with the grass tops organizations, those linkages have not always been strong in our state. And there has been, so much, so much that is happening to make sure that those linkages are strong, and our funding is really intentional about making sure that happens, and obviously the way that we're trying to bring folks together. So all of that is tremendously exciting, not to mention, as we're talking about, the increased awareness, about the harms of our system, and that also just on the COVID piece too, which has lifted up, the conditions within prisons. Michigan had the highest number of folks that were incarcerated that died of COVID, a number of correctional officers. All of that has been, really lifted the conversation around these issues. I think the challenge, and there are several and many, more fundamentally, a challenge that I think philanthropy is created to meet is sort of the long-term view and patience around, it's not just an individual campaign, it's about deep investment and strategy that creates this thriving environment of strong organizations, advocates, partnerships, data, all the rest of it, that lead to all the things to come. And so that is both a challenge and an opportunity, but particularly for funders, something to be thoughtful about your particular role in this space. And that, that's something to lean into for sure.
Just another Scottie Pippen moment, because my last question for you is, what's your advice for partners in Rochester as they start to jumpstart this conversation?
I think certainly, so from the funding perspective, recognizing your role in having a long-term view, as I've said, having humility in this work, right? I think that
it will break you down.
Yes. And funders are, it's an interesting place to be. Having spent most of my career elsewhere, it is a really interesting place to be. And I think folks are generally aware of that. But if you are setting a table, know that you are setting a table to be leaderful, and to be figuring out how you are in service of the folks that are, again, most proximate to the issues.
I love it. I would be remiss as I stop just, when Melanca talks about any work that we've done in Michigan, by us, she means a gentleman on my team who is not me. And that's to talking about being leaderful. I often get to join these conversations, but the truth is that they're brilliant people that we've all assembled that will help us do that. To that end, I want to turn it over to Simeon Bannister at the Rochester Community Foundation to help us facilitate walk through some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Candice and Melanca. This has been an amazing conversation, a lot of nuggets. Melanca, I'm going to need you to go back. You talked about something when you talked about, I need you to make the statement again as we move forward. You talked about policing is the most visible manifestation of a system. And I feel like I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But before we get there, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Maya Crane. I am the Program Officer of Equity at the Rochester Area Community Foundation. And we have also my esteemed colleague, Simeon Bannister, who is the VP of the Community Programs team at the Foundation. We thank you all for being here. We know this wasn't the easiest conversation. This is the work that happens after we are done protesting and advocating, and this is what the work looks like. So again, Candice and Melanca, thank you so much for all of the time and energy you've put into this. And
being able to lead this work both in Michigan and nationally. So Melanca, we'll start with you. If you can really go into more of what you were talking about. I love that saying of policing is the most visible manifestation of a system that has been oppressing Black and Brown individuals, and some thought behind that, and your reasons for saying that. I agree, but just your reasons for saying that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is literally the case because as we've seen, and that is, these issues aren't new, but they have been made visible by by literal cameras and revelation of what is happening, and it is physical brutality that we are seeing, and the undergirding of that, I think, is the lack of recognition. I'm not saying anything surprising about the fundamental humanity of Black people, and I think it is that core case which obviously has led to and leads to police brutality, but also leads to a general apathy around what is happening in our population in terms of incarceration, the disparity in sentences, and the impact on communities for folks to be taken out of the community, where and I didn't say much about this, but so much of the core place where we would like to end with the Michigan Justice Fund, or what we would like to see it accelerate, disrupt, is the idea that the way to keep us safe is to be investing in our communities, in partnership with our communities. And so we've got, I won't run down the string of investments that we've been able to make, but they are very deliberate and wanting to be long-sighted about that. And that's the other thing that's being really great about having partner funders that are not just focused on the CJ issues, that are focused on the investment side. Because those are the types of investments, mental health, housing, all the rest of it, that have those implications.
So let me just echo Maya's gratitude for both of you being with us. I really do appreciate it. And I really wanted to circle back, Melanca, you talked a little bit about the impact that, in this case, the kind of systemic failure in policing has on the community. And we know that that's not limited, unfortunately, to just the criminal justice system. A lot of systems are failing communities. How do you communicate progress or the potential for progress to folks that are in the community that are justifiably cynical about systems' ability to be responsive?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is worth noting, to take Michigan, because I'm in Michigan, that there actually has been progress. I talked about the policy wins of the last year, but the incarceration trends have decreased. So, sort of you look from the war on drugs from that moment till now, it's like, multiple 100% increase. But there has been progress, and what's interesting is and it's important from our orientation around the Michigan Justice Fund to lift up the racial disparities in the system. Part of what's also true is that this is affecting everybody. And so, for example, on pretrial detention, in Wayne County, that number has been going down. In the rural counties, it's gone up by 50%. So there's a lot of, we talked about narrative change. Part of it is informing folks kind of our shared destiny around these issues. I think there are particular things to point to. I also, though, would say that I don't think it's what's interesting about the ecosystem, the push and pull. I mentioned that I'm pragmatic. I'm quite aware that there are advocates, for example, around the policing fund who there's been a whole conversation around defund the police, and for most folks that talk about it, that's a nuanced conversation, but they're advocates that are absolutely serious. That's what they mean. And I'm not one to say, that that's not what they mean. They are, I don't see it as my role to change hearts and mind in that direction, but I am aware, sort of as, we as a funders collaborative try to achieve our goals, kind of just understanding where everybody is at, and using our sort of knowledge and ability to see sort of, and that's another wonderful thing about philanthropy, having the bandwidth to kind of lift your eyes up across the system, but just understanding where those pieces are. to make the progress that we can see and achieve.
Thanks. We have a question from Amanda who asks, can you describe the process of drafting the canvas to narrow in and identify issues?
Sure. So if that's with respect to the Michigan Justice Fund, the grant making strategy, we had as I mentioned, the 26 organizations in the learning cohort. Not every session that we had with that group was about our grant making strategy. So it was also a platform that we will continue to have to lift up issues and work that is happening in the field. We brought in state policy makers and such into those conversations, and that was an important piece, and I mentioned some of that as well. But in terms of the actual work to do the refinement, it was hard work. We had a facilitator, a consultant from the Council of State Governments that has been with us since the beginning of the fund, even before actually she headed over to the Council of State Governments, that helped because it's work, organizing folks. 26 folks is a lot of people to get input from. Breakout sessions that happened, written feedback that we got, all of that, it was quite a bit of sausage making that just had to, the work had to be put in to get us to where we landed.
So Mark, we have, and Candice, we have an interesting scenario here in Rochester where there's a lot of momentum now. We're seeing some of this from city government. Recently, city government announced that they were going to be creating an Office of Neighborhood Safety. There have been some changes made at the police department, including fully funding the Police Accountability Board in the proposed budget. And so the pace of activity appears to be quickening from city government. I'm curious what advice you have for community partners, for funders, for other folks that want to engage the municipality when the pace starts to quicken and folks are kind of like, wait, how do we make sure that we're having as community engaged a process as possible so that the solutions are connected to community sentiment and preference?
I think it's tricky because like Melanca, I am a pragmatist. So I think it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Because if the municipality was not responding, and just as an outsider looking at Rochester, I'd like to see some responsivity. We'd be saying they're moving too slow. But then you're right, in a situation like this, I think why the process of what happened in Michigan is so powerful is because what I believe Hudson Weber, what Melanca and her colleagues were doing was they were building buy-in. You build momentum towards sustained change by figuring out ways to bring people along. And so, whether or not you're having a canvas, you're having a convening, you're doing some combination of the two, what you're doing is building buy-in. And I think for the gravity of change that community there in Rochester would like to see, and for its ability to have a sustained impact, buy-in is going to be important. So it'll be important on the municipality to still really be intentional about that engagement, but it's also important for funders and stakeholders outside to ensure that they are really action oriented and also moving fast. Like there's an exigency to the need, so everybody has to move, and making sure that they're bringing one another along. One of the things that I think sometimes happens in this work, and this is why I asked Melanca so many questions about how do you keep these stakeholders together when differing people come to the table, there's this idea that we all in each moment have to be in perfect alignment. I don't believe that. I think we have to be in continued conversations, even at times when those conversations become difficult, and they always have to remain open and respectful. But I actually think there are going to be times when everything isn't perfectly in sync, but everybody's got to keep moving, because the need is so great. And so I think that's something that I would really think for stakeholders and as a philanthropic institution. I also think that you guys would get immediately really action oriented and moving, and continue to be building that outside momentum that no matter what the municipality is going to do, is going to hold them accountable to actually be giving people change.
That's so well said. Just that point about don't assume you'll get to perfect alignment, and certainly for philanthropy to try to beat people into like that's not the right role. I just wanted to add and lift up just again the benefit of, and it relates to your question about how do you keep people sort of inspired, I guess, to action. But the thing that has been so lovely to have partners like Public Welfare Foundation and John Day, who is the partner that we have, that we get to have so much of his time for, but just with the national partners, you know, you talked about the Office of Neighborhood Safety. There are other communities that are moving in that direction. And it is absolutely not necessary, if you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So certainly calling on partners that have funded and partnered with other communities where there's something to point to, I think is invaluable.
Great information. I'm going to say this right now. I know we're getting close to 1 o'clock. So if Candice and Melanca will give us a few more minutes, we would love to get through some of these questions, but we know that some of you may have to leave. We are recording this, and this will be on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back, if you had a question and we haven't gotten to it yet, please know we're going to try to get through as many of these questions as possible. If they have a few more minutes that they can give us of their time to be able to continue this conversation, because there's some great questions coming in that we would like to get to. So one of the questions that came up was, I thought this was, and goes to the whole foundation, is, can you talk more about what Hudson Weber Foundation is doing to support advocacy regarding the need to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act?
So Hudson Weber is, as I mentioned, a Detroit foundation. So we are not directly involved or supporting organizations that are working on federal legislation. So we're not directly in that space. Candice might have something to say to that, but I did want to flag that there is a whole nother conversation we probably don't have time for, but an interesting work that needs to be thought through for foundations as they support advocacy, because there's a difference between C3 and C4 work. So just wanted to mention that as an issue as that came up. But Candice might have a perspective on the federal work as a national funder.
I think the truth is that, and this sort of cuts to the core of this conversation, so much of our bet right now is on local jurisdictions, I'll be honest, and in part because on issues of policing, on issues of justice reform, jails and prisons, the rubber hits the road in these local jurisdictions. What will impact, we believe, the daily lived experience of people, the lion's share of that work is going to happen on the ground, and that's why we're really trying to push our resources there. So we have national philanthropic partners that we've had for some time, and we continue to fund them, obviously, as Melanca very capably set out within the boundaries of C3 funding. But we are betting big on the jurisdictions that we're in, because actually we believe they're going to have the biggest impact on the lived experience, as evidenced by the conversation today.
So earlier there was a little mention of the Bulls and the Pistons, and so I was hoping that a question would come in that would allow me to reference the now playoff-bound New York Knicks, who appear to have learned from observing successful teams and adopting some of their practices. The question that's come in is, what do you see as the role for nonprofit organizations to address racial inequity? And can you offer some successful examples from the communities that you're in that nonprofits are taking to address racial inequity that we might model?
Yeah. Why can I take that first, Melanca? We're in a couple of communities. I think people are thinking about it in a renewed way. So we have organizations that we've worked with that are intentionally people of color led, impacted people led, and we think that that's been powerful. But organizations where racial equity and that kind of leadership is not represented had traditionally been their mission, I think are trying to be more intentional about it in this moment in history. And my thinking is that it's not about what you did yesterday, it's about what you do now and tomorrow. Everybody has a responsibility to step up to this issue. If you are working, as Melanca has already said in this conversation, I don't know what the issue you could think you're working on where that cuts to the core that racial equity isn't important. But if you believe that it's education or, economic development or housing, it's at the core of all of those issues. And so you need to really be intentional about it, about making sure that you understand, because usually at the core of each one of those issues, the group that is most impacted is primarily, Black communities. Black and Brown communities are having the most disparate impact on any one of those indicators. And that means that the institution working to champion change there has to be willing to be intentional about looking at their data, telling that story, and having initiatives and policies that address those issues, both certainly outside of the organization, but frankly, it usually also has some impact on how they work inside the organization.
Yeah, and I would only, I guess, add two things to that. One is just, and this is not just true for nonprofits, but for all of us out here, our U.S. education system does a terrible job of teaching about this. I know I talked about law school, but when you talk about that you could get through your education and not understand the history of structural disinvestment in our communities and be out here operating and just not be aware of that is unfortunately true. And so you need to invest in your education around what's happened. And the only other thing I'd say just on the funder side, on top of what Candice said, is that, there's a role for us, of course, to hold ourselves accountable about what we're doing, but also in terms of how we're funding to have these conversations with our partners. And it's not just about who's leading the organizations, as Candice said, although that's important, but also what the actual approach is to whatever the work that is being done by these partners.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you, Melanca, on that. And this actually gets to what you were talking about. Dinesh had a question that talked about how do you bring in community input, particularly from populations less engaged and formally educated, but knowledgeable about the needs in their community. And this is one of the areas where Rochester Area Community Foundation is really trying to push in to make sure that we have space. Almost we're removing the whole table and really being able to engage in the community and understanding that it shouldn't always be the squeaky wheel that gets the oil, because there are a lot of individuals that play a part in here, but just don't believe, one, they're a leader, or feel as if their voice isn't heard, or they're not knowledgeable, they're not educated. So what does that look like to be able to engage in them in a way that's authentic and letting them know that they are part of the change that we want to see in our community?
I would start by saying it's being really intentional. For us as a national foundation, you're always going into a community and you've got no you got no street cred, right? You're not from there. And I think on a local level, you guys should be approaching those communities in the same way. You've got no street credibility there. So you need to go in with the intent to win trust. And whether or not that's employing someone there who has interest and credibility to be your partner and advocate as you start to gain relationships and trust, right? Notice that I'm embedding in that as you are requiring people's time, you are compensating them for that. That you have, like we do in so many areas of work, try to leverage the opportunity to get credible messengers to give you entree as you establish relationships, but it will take time. Like, it is a consistent work to be building trust in any community that you're working in, from whatever vantage point it is, whether it's national to state and local, whether it's local to communities most impacted by the issues that you're informing. And I think the balance of the work and the patience is on the philanthropic partner, the nonprofit partner that is empowered, because traditionally we've had more resources to be able to do that.
That's, yeah, totally. And I would just say, and I mentioned, the size of my foundation when we started, and I think that is, to go deep into community with the number of folks that we have on our team, there's no way to do that without a partner. But I'd also say that there is, again, a value, even when you think about, folks on the other side, for philanthropic partners to come together to support each other in that outreach, and to do it together with the credible partners that Candice has discussed. I think it's just higher impact.
I'd like to talk to my two pragmatists this afternoon, and really kind of reference here in Rochester. There was the mayor and the county executive called together the RAISE Commission, the Racial and Structural Equity Commission. And the RAISE Commission put together a report over 200 pages with suggestions, some new ideas, some rearticulation of important ideas that had been advanced before. And in sum total, I think all of us are kind of waiting with bated breath to have the conversation about how those ideas get implemented. So I just want to hear you guys kind of talk about the kind of idea of moving from the idea in the ideation phase to the implementation phase, and just some best practices to ensure that those ideas don't kind of get left in the ether, but actually get realized.
I love that. I love that for a couple of reasons, because the pragmatist in me hates a long report. I'll be honest with you. I'm a massive advocate of the executive summary, because I'm all about giving people stuff they really read. And so I say that to say a couple of things, which is that, okay, you got 200 pages. Nobody has 200 pages of priority, right? By design, priority means a short list. So what are those things? And I think one of the things that you guys are doing is looking to see from your leadership, what's their short list, you know, amongst those 200 pages. But then also, I think what's really going to be important is that the community, you guys, what's your short list? Are they the same or are they different? Stop waiting with bated breath. Ain't nobody coming to save you. So then the thing is that what are the priorities that a group of stakeholders are driving and demanding that may overlap with that list of priorities that leaders are articulating there, or may not, right? But be careful of this, and this is actually a bigger field issue of sort of being like, okay, they're there, what are they gonna do for us? That's not how it works. It's sort of like the agency of being like, this is what we need and this is what we're gonna hold you to account for. Thank you for this deluge of paper. This is what we're gonna hold you to account for.
And I just, you know, as a community foundation, something I didn't mention, but that has been integral to how we've sought our partners for the Michigan Justice Fund. Y'all are wonderfully situated in terms of, you know, your donor engagement and the broad swath of people that you must engage as a community foundation that is different than any other type of funder in our particular ecosystem. And so I'm stating the obvious. I know that you guys know all of this, but really just on that agency point, thinking of the particular power that you have in helping to drive those conversations to lead towards implementation, to you know, convene the tables that Candice was talking about, just are even that much more amplified given the particular role that you guys have.
Great information. I love it. No one is going to come save us. I agree with that. I'm tempted to put like Candice's Venmo in the chat so you all can just bless her, because I feel like she's given us a lot of knowledge, but I won't. But thank you for that information. One of the things that we do need to acknowledge is Rochester is part of a larger community, and it's just part of a community. And one of the things that we have is we have the city Rochester Police Department, but we also have the county sheriff. And one of the things that Lee has asked is, can you speak to what it would look like or how we could go about convening them? Again, as we continue to work towards wanting to have a more equitable and just community for all. And as a community foundation and many other foundations in Rochester, we serve more than one county. So as we continue to do this work here, what we don't want to do is strengthen Monroe County and then have to and forget about our other counties out there. So if you both or one of you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, when we did the first roundtable convening, we had a table set around community policing, and we brought sheriffs, police, you know, law enforcement, police chiefs, and advocates that work on these issues. Again, very diverse group that came together. But I think that there's something to be said, particularly for agencies that are adjacent to each other. There's an opportunity, I think, to, and this is how we were thinking about it for the Community Policing Innovations Fund, which was a multi-county endeavor, but a way to lift up and put folks together. I mean, I thought it was fascinating that after the uprisings that happened over the spring and summer of last year, that our law enforcement agencies there was no table set that, I was at the Office of Community-Oriented Policing. We set lots of tables for folks to share information with each other and the like. But there were no conversations happening about how agencies were responding to what was happening, for better or for worse. And so folks were happy. I think there's an opportunity for our fund as we're doing these partnerships to also lift up the good that is being done to inform and seed across multiple jurisdictions. But I would put some thought informed by folks on the ground that are working on these issues every day of what you want to convene around. I mentioned that the roundtable that we had, we kind of came in with a set of things for folks to react to and to work with, just to keep the momentum and the intentionality around outcomes that's necessary to move the ball.
We recently had a chance to participate in a listening session here in Rochester with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. And one of the things that was really lifted up in that conversation was the chance to rethink the Community Reinvestment Act in terms of not only the enforcement of the act, but then also how the funds that it generates could be used to, sustain the initiatives of the community. Question comes in around any initiatives with respect to banking and the CRA that encourages the banking community to better meet the needs of the communities that they service. And they ask specifically about the types of products and services they provide and establishing approaches that meet community members where they are. So any kind of interrelation between, and I'm going to kind of modify this question a little bit to kind of just talk even more about the CRA and funds that are being generated there to create sustainability for some of the initiatives that are underway.
So I don't want to get over my skis. I do think the Biden administration is, they might have just announced that they are rethinking regs, and that's like all I want to say because I don't want to mess up whether that's true or not, but I think that literally was perhaps recently announced, and that the changes that the Trump administration made are not going through. But I do know, I said we have a broad mission area, so we are certainly thinking about, and it is related, it's all related, but how do we ensure that the funds, and of course with the American Recovery Act on the horizon, how does it get to small African-American owned businesses, and that took, and we hope the experience of what happens here in Detroit, which is the highest percentage of African-American city in the country, that this will be a laboratory for whether the type of objectives that the CRA had in mind come to fruition. So we've just, been working with partners to canvass what do our businesses look like. And then for our intermediary partners that are putting dollars into our community, including the banks, obviously, to really lift up, if you try to devise interventions that serve the demographics that we're describing, everybody can benefit from it. It's sort of that curb cut and peel. But there's some real obstacles. It's just as expensive for banks to do underwriting for small loans as it is for big loans. So there need to be creative solutions to get at this. But I don't want to say too much because I'm not an expert.
I agree.
Great question, though.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I agree with Melanca that I don't want to be out of my depth. But the one thing that I say that I think goes back to your point on what the municipality is doing around justice reform is that all of these issues, the devil will be in the details on what happens at the local level. Somebody will interpret what larger rules and regulation will mean and how resources will be distributed in jurisdictions. And so that means collective action and power tables will be critically important because either they'll be assembled to help drive those priorities or there won't. I know we're getting close to time, and one thing that I want to make sure that I really intentionally do before we wrap is just stop and say thank Melanca for joining me in this conversation and frankly, joining me in this field and in this partnership. It has been incredible to follow your lead in Michigan, and I am always in awe of everything that you're doing, but I am thrilled that you were willing to join us today to just talk about some of the work that you've done in the community there, in the community for Rochester. So thank you guys, and thank you so much to the Rochester Community Foundation for your work and intentionality around these issues.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Maya. I just want to chime in and say perhaps you guys, the Rochester Community Foundation, can have us back so we can reverse and hear more from Candice about all the important and wonderful work that she and the Public Welfare Foundation is doing. But so glad to be invited into this conversation, and really excited about the work that I've heard is happening in Rochester, and really grateful for you to invite us both in.
Yes, thank you both for being here, and I thank you for our attendees who stayed on a little while longer. This has been a great conversation. We are looking forward to continuing to see the work that both of you are doing. We are hoping to work with Candice sooner than later on the work here in Rochester, and I'll turn it to Simeon, who may have some last thoughts or just last thoughts about what we need to do in Rochester to continue to move us forward.
Yeah, no, just another acknowledgement of gratitude to both Melanca and Candice for joining us this afternoon. We certainly appreciate it. And I think as we start to look forward, we know that a hallmark, certainly for our efforts at the Community Foundation, for Rochester in general, has been to really start to focus on collaborative action. How do we work together to make this community as strong and resilient as it possibly can be? And I think what we've heard today are some real clear examples that work is happening all across the country. And we're excited about the idea that certainly in the home of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and others that have really paved the way in this country for conversations around social justice and really making progress through collaborative action, through working together. I love what Candice said earlier. Being at the table doesn't mean we all have to, agree and march to the same beat, but it does mean we have to agree to stay at the table together. And so as we think about our next steps, it's certainly an agreement to continue to work with and collaborate with others to continue to partner and to do so in a way that makes Rochester the best that it can possibly be. With that, I think we'll say goodbye.
Yes, thank you all. Have a great Wednesday.